Now, Sudan military leaders have reinstated deposed Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok. This development follows a deal signed by the country's military and civilian leaders to reinstate him. According to the deal, the military will also release government officials and politicians arrested since the October the 25th coup. Sudan's top general Abdel Fattah Burhan says the reinstated Prime Minister will lead an independent technocratic cabinet until elections can be held. Let's broaden this out by speaking virtually, with our guest from Washington, D.C. to discuss this interesting development in Sudan, global affairs analyst Calvin Dark. Calvin, thank you so much for joining us. How will the people of Sudan know whether the agreement Prime Minister Hamdok signed is what is good for the country? Remember, the civilian coalition that nominated him as Prime Minister 2 years ago refused to acknowledge any new deal. They said the pact had been struck with a gun to his head.
Well, I think that the two indicators, not only for the people of Sudan, but for everyone else around the world, well, one, will the violence that stops, against the protesters, that's the most immediate indicator. But then also, what does the path towards truly civilian rule look like leading up to elections? That's going to be the real choice here. But I think a lot of what we're seeing is that the now reinstated minister, who was a hero to many of the protesters, it looked like he gave in. Where I'm thinking that he chose the lesser of two evils. That they're working with the military isn't what a lot of the protesters wanted, but he, and along with people in Sudan and outside of Sudan, didn't want the continued violence.
Well, Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok was trying to make it look like the army did a very good job by saying the army acted to prevent a civil war that was threatening to erupt because political groups had been inciting civilians against the security forces. What sense does this argument make to you?
I think that the reinstated Prime Minister said what he had to say to bring things, to calm things down a bit. And, he understands that this is, as some of the protesters say, courting the enemy. And we really have to look at who supports this deal. We have, of course, the military and then the reinstated Prime Minister, but we also have key world powers like the United States who've welcomed it. And I think welcomed it just because it tamps down the tensions, or at least it should, with the violence. But he's got to do a lot to regain the confidence of the people, particularly those who don't agree with this new agreement ahead of elections in, I think, 2023.
Well, the government the people of Sudan want to see is a government that is completely independent of the military, just like Mr. Hamdok said that he had agreed to the deal to stop the violence. But if the military is still in the picture, will this stop the protest on the streets of Sudan?
I think there'll still be protests because one of the other elements that the protesters have been speaking about is accountability from members of the military, particularly over the violence that we've seen recently. But, this may be the calmest, or maybe not calmest, the least violent path, which doesn't mean that there won't be more protests because of the involvement in the military. But it does mean that the transitional government has an opportunity to show that they really are trying to put together elections, and it's not just kicking the can further down the road.
Well, so many other countries have actually, thrown their weight behind this new agreement, new pact that was being signed. Talk about the UN, the US, and some other countries. Is that to say that Sudan, this new agreement puts them on the right track?
I think that it puts them on the track that the international community feels most comfortable with, including the United States. As you know, Secretary Blinken, was just in Africa. I think he's on his way back or came back last night or today. So I wouldn't read too much into what it says for the long term. I think the U.S. and the other world powers do hope that the transition to a civilian-led government, that happens as is being planned. But I think the U.S. and others' main focus now was stopping the violence and trying to calm down some of the protests. So in that sense, the move right now was sanctioned by the U.S. and other powers, but that's just for the short term.
Well, Calvin, before I let you go, what real actions would you like to see that will bring peace to the Horn of Africa?
Well, as an American, I would like to see the Biden administration do more than words, and there were of course issues of sanctions. I wish we would take a stronger role when it comes to promoting real democracy. I think that not only in Sudan, but in certain places in Africa, they need the U.S. support for democracy. Whereas I think the U.S. Political, whether it be Congress or the White House, no matter who's in the White House, Americans want stability, and that's good, like I said, for the short term, but it doesn't really speak to the needs for Sudan and other countries in Africa for long-term democratic development and progress. So that's my wish, that I wish we would get a little more involved.
Well, absolutely. Well, it still remains to be seen what will become of Sudan after these new pacts that has been signed. Global Affairs Analyst Calvin Duck, thank you so much for coming up on that very short notice.
Thank you.